So this is a carry on from yesterday's talk, and what today we're going to talk about is insulin. Excuse me. So I talked yesterday about how cortisol is an energy releasing hormone, which should normally be a good thing. It releases energy in a time of stress. It will release energy from protein, which is muscle. It'll break muscle tissue down, break it into the form of glucose through gluconeogenesis. It will do this with fat as well, predominantly visceral fat, subcutaneous fat, which is spongy stuff on the outside. But this is all good if it was just an acute response. But whenever it's a chronic release, chronic stress release, we also get a hormone that comes into play then, which is called LPL, lipoprotein lipase. And what unfortunately that does is it takes the fat and redistributes it into visceral fat, which is the unhealthy fat, which is stuff accumulates around the organs. What it does then is, because it's actually putting all this energy back into the system, for example, it's breaking down muscle tissue and it's putting it back into the system as blood glucose, it's elevating your blood glucose. Because again, in times of stress, you need to get energy from somewhere because you're not eating any food. To elevate blood glucose, the body has to produce it from somewhere. So it'll break down fat, it'll put that into the system, but when LPL is released, or LPL is predominantly high because it's chronic, it'll just bring it from visceral fat straight back into, from subcutaneous fat straight into visceral fat. It'll break down muscle tissue and put that into your bloodstream to give you some sort of energy. Now, whenever blood glucose levels are elevated, this is when insulin comes along. So insulin has to come now and try and store that into the cell. Now, I've talked about this in previous videos before, but try to put it now and the linking together with yesterday's video. So we've got this chronically high cortisol. Now again, we didn't specify as to why it's chronically high. It could be different reasons. It could be prolonged stress, it could be hormonal fluctuations, it could be various different things. It could be just you're just a very, very stressed person all the time. It could be something like we talked about Cushing's disease or Cushing's syndrome, where there's actually a lesion or a tumor on the pituitary gland affecting the hypothalamic pituitary gland adrenal axis, which is just constantly then stimulating. Again, you'll know this by the body type. You'll see this. I mean, someone again with a big round face, a big sort of bit of fat in the back. Now, I'm not talking about just a wee bit. I'm talking about actually quite visible, very skinny limbs, big boobs with women, and a big belly, and lots of stretch marks. Lots of really, really red stretch marks. This is all cortisol. Also, someone who bruises very, very easily. It's also a sign of elevated cortisol. So, the role of insulin. Now, blood glucose levels are constantly elevated, even if you're not eating food. This is then problematic because insulin levels are chronically high, which means then at the cell wall, think about the cell that you allow energy into. So when you think about a cell, every cell in your body, but specifically muscle cells, right? Specific, because they're the ones who are going to absorb most of the glucose, because there's a lot of muscle tissue compared to every other cell. So they're what we call glucose dumps. So if you eat, let's say your cells are working well, we eat carbohydrates, we eat some sort of sugar, blood sugar elevate, our muscles are just like sponges because we've been active, we've been training, we've been doing stuff, and it'll just absorb all that energy, and blood glucose levels will come straight back down, and insulin can then just go away. So insulin's job is to store energy, to tell the cells they open up to store energy. And specifically a part of the cell, inside the cell, there's a wee activator called GLUT4. Now that's important to understand. Please remember that GLUT4. There's a whole GLUT1, GLUT2, GLUT3, but GLUT4. So imagine a cell, right? Muscle cell, any cell, even a fat cell, right? Fat cells are the same. There's a GLUT4 inside the fat cell. Insulin comes, there's a receptor on top of the cell that insulin activates, insulin attaches onto. Now, it's important to remember as well too, the receptor, the insulin receptor. Every cell has an insulin receptor, and a receptor is just an attachment point. The way I visualize it in my head is, think about a wee thing that can sit on top of the cell. Insulin comes, attaches on it, it grabs the insulin, that sends a signal inside the GLUT4 to say, come up and open the cell wall and allow the glucose to come in, allow that blood sugars to come in. That brings blood sugar levels back down to baseline, and it means that a cell is full of energy, ready to rock and do all good things, right? So insulin's chronically high because cortisol's chronically high, because that's constantly breaking down muscle tissue and constantly keeping blood sugar levels elevated, even without food, right, in times of stress. So cortisol's releasing insulin, cortisol's releasing energy, insulin then is trying to store that energy. But what happens, because insulin is so high, and because as well too, remember what we talked about the fat getting broken down into the bloodstream, and then LPL then is in storing it as visceral fat. In the process of that, there's a lot of fat floating around the system. So there's a double whammy here. One, the cell can get covered in fat, which means that the receptor site can no longer our insulin can no longer reach this receptor site because there's a fatty membrane covering the cell. And also, sometimes it could be either or, double whammy, or sometimes one or the other or both. Insulin's so high and it's pounded on this receptor that the receptor becomes resistant to insulin because it's just getting hit all the time, because it's not supposed to do that. That's not the way it's supposed to happen. If you think about in nature, apart from the stress response, how much sugar would we eat in a day? If you think about in nature, I mean, if we were completely living off the land, I don't mean farming. Remember, we evolved over about 300, 400,000 years. We're only farming about 5,000 years. It's a very short time. Farming meaning that we're growing our own food, agriculture and stuff like that, where we can manipulate harvest and do all that kind of stuff. So if we were eating off the land, fruit and vegetables, which would be the only predominantly source of carbohydrates, and they would be seasonal. They wouldn't even be all year round. And even that, remember, we're not farming, so there wouldn't be vineyards of the stuff or orchards of the stuff. There would be wee bits and pieces lying about as we could forage it and find it, hunter-gatherers kind of thing. So the amount of insulin you would release would be very, very slow and very minimal. Right? This is why pancreatic, it's hard to say in the morning, pancreatic cancer is on the rise, because there's so much sugar getting hit in the system that the beta cells of the pancreas are constantly getting hit really, really hard, and it's causing burnout. So the cell literally gets burnt out, which means all that blood sugar that's floating around cannot get into the cell. Right? Remember, LPL is elevated really high. LPL is telling the body to store visceral fat. So whenever we do eat carbohydrates, right, it's a double whammy effect, because all that blood sugar is floating around just because the muscle tissue is getting bloated around because cortisol levels are elevated, and now you're dumping in carbohydrates and sugar and all this the shitty stuff, which make it even higher. So the body fat's just going to store as visceral fat, store, and everything that you eat is literally getting stored here. And while meanwhile, your energy levels are going down because there's no energy in the cell to actually make you feel like you're getting any energy from the food, which means insulin's to the roof. When insulin's to the roof, this triggers a hormonal effect for hunger, because the cell's going, I'm empty. There's no food in this cell. That triggers ghrelin. Ghrelin says, you need to give me some food because there's no energy in the cell, because GLUT4 is telling me there's nothing coming in. So I must be hungry. Sugar craving, eating more sugar, dump even higher. And you can see how this is a massive effect, all because of the first thing that's happening here is the cortisol and the knock-on effect of that. So we need to understand this process. So whenever you're getting these sugar cravings, you've got to understand there's a whole cascade of a hormonal effect, that if we could fix the initial problem, this is why we're talking about this, because we want to get to the root cause of what is happening here with everything. Again, we haven't talked about why cortisol is elevated. There's different reasons, but that's predominantly what's happening here. This is why I call it mental belly or stress belly that we get around here. Even men get it from the exact same process, right? Although for women it's a lot more sort of prevalent because of the way menopause and things happen, or because of the way that women sort of react to stress more than men, because these are emotional creatures rather than logical creatures. It's not my words, it's fact, right? So that's what we need to think about here. How do we manage this here? So think about everything that we says again, trying to keep this as simple as possible. So one of the things that we're going to be able to talk about now in tomorrow's video is why that cortisol level is pumping, and what can we do about it, and what can we do about the whole thing from a nutrition point of view, a lifestyle point of view, an exercise point of view, and why those three elements, or those four elements, exercise, nutrition, mindset, and sleep, are actually the key to fixing the core problem, the root cause of the issue. Does that make sense? Again, any questions, let me know.